I'm Ken Schoon, and I was born and raised in the city, and I taught at this campus for a number of years. And I was, as a kid, we would go out to the dunes frequently. There were two places we could go in those days. One was to Marquette Park in the city, and the other was the state park in Porter County. If I had lived a little further east, I could have gone to Washington Park in Michigan City. And there were other places as well, but places as a kid I didn't go to. I didn't know much about the history of the lake. It was water. It was a lake, and it was pretty, and it was a great place to go in the summertime. And I knew as far as weather was concerned, in the summer it's cooler by the lake, and in the winter it can be warmer into the lake. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. Today, most of the Chicago area is getting nice warm temperatures. If you're up near the lake, you don't enjoy them because it's cooler by the lake. And so the temperature is closer to the 40s if the prognosticators from yesterday were correct. And then farther away from the lake, it gets a little bit warmer. And on a day like today in March, warmth is kind of nice. The history of the lake I knew nothing about as a kid. And I really didn't know where I would find it. So it was as an adult and as a faculty member here that I found it necessary to do a little bit of research and see what other geologists had found along the way. And so when I talk about the history of Lake Michigan, I like to start with the oldest part. And to do that, I'm going to ask a question that sounds like it has nothing to do with the history of Lake Michigan. How many people in this room have been to or mainly eaten at Teeble's restaurant? If you look around the room with the hands still up, you'll see that's almost everybody. If you haven't, you've missed a really nice place where you can get really good food. How many of you knew that Teeble's restaurant is a lakeside restaurant? Two people who have heard me before. Lake Michigan used to be a lot bigger than it is today. In fact, a lot bigger. This campus is built on the bottom of the lake. But the lake was gone, of course, by this time. Although it would be hard to tell that in 2008 when the parking lot north of this building had water up to your knees. And the old Tamarack building, which was the first building that was built on this campus and had a big, beautiful theater and classrooms and things of that sort, had no stairs going into that theater. It was, the first floor was level with the ground. So when you walked to the main door, you opened the door and walked in, you just, there were no steps, no incline, it was at ground level. You then walked halfway across the building, and to your right you went into the theater, and you find yourself at the back row. And then as you walk towards the front, the floor slopes. You got lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. And when you stood at the edge of the stage, you were considerably below the ground level outside. But in front of the stage was an orchestra pit. And the orchestra pit was lower than where you would be standing. And behind the orchestra pit was a pathway. If you needed to get from one side of the stage to the other without being seen, you could walk, and everybody called it a catwalk, which is a stupid name for it because a catwalk is always up high. This was way down low, but that was called the catwalk, and if you used it among people who worked at the theater, they knew what you were talking about. And I never saw the floor of the catwalk dry. I never did. It was always wet, and they had taken pallets, old industrial pallets, and put them all across the length of the catwalk because it was always wet there. That's sort of the leftover of Lake Michigan when it used to be out in this area. During the flood, if the flood was knee-high in the parking lot, as soon as the water started covering the grass on campus, and when it reached the door of Tamarack Hall, it flowed in because there were no steps going up into the building. And once it was in on the lobby, then it would flow down to the front of the theater. And the flood destroyed the building. It couldn't be used for anything when it was over. Not necessarily a bad thing. One of the lounges always had mold on the wall. It was not the best building on campus. It's not on campus anymore. I wondered why it was called Tamarack. And I learned talking to a biology professor. How many people in here are biology majors? Okay. But anyway, he was on the committee to choose a name for it, because at first it was the Gary campus, then it became Gary Main campus, the main building on the campus. But Main is not a very exciting name. So they wanted to give it a real name, like a tree or something like the other buildings on campus. And the committee recommended Tamarack, and the chancellor thought it was a good idea, and so it became Tamarack. Why Tamarack? Because the tamarack tree grows in wetlands. And the biology department knew how wet the building could be. Only the theater department knew it more closely. And so it was called Tamarack because tamaracks grow in wet, marshy areas, and that was the description of this campus. Now, why do I say that Teeble's restaurant is a lakeside restaurant? Next time you go to Teeble's, stand at the front main door, look around you. US 30 highway is built on the beach. Beaches can be kind of wide, of course, and the level of the lake, just like today, it's in one year and the next year it may not be exactly the same. It was the same idea then. But south of US 30 is a landscape that doesn't look anything like the bottom of the lake. It's hilly. It has a lot of sand dunes, and dunes or hills made from the glaciers that made that landscape. But US 30 was a beach made by the waves of Lake Michigan, and north of US 30 at Teeble's restaurant and other places, the ground slopes down as you go north into the low area that was the bottom of the Lake Michigan in that time period, and that's where you'll find Walmart and Strachan Van Til and the other stores that are there today. You can find that same situation from Michigan through northwest Indiana into Illinois and into Wisconsin. It's not contiguous because there's been 150 years of development here, and bulldozers come by here. The biggest town on US 30 is Schererville, at least in this part. And Mr. Scherer, who was the first settler, who platted the town and decided where the streets were going to be and all of that, he sold sand as a commercial venture. So a lot of the sand dunes that were in Schererville, Dyer area were mined and sold to people who needed sand, because there was so much of sand here, and he couldn't see any reason for keeping those dunes. And he set a precedent for thinking of sand sand dunes instead of being a natural resource and something that has a unique form of plants and animals that live around there. Instead, it became a commodity. You buy a parcel of land that has a high sand dune, and you sell the sand. And that was done in Lake County, it was done in Porter County, it was done in LaPorte County. And in LaPorte, you had the biggest, well, I'll get to that later, the biggest sand dune in Indiana, but that was later. So north of US 30, the ground slopes down, and then it remains kind of low until you get to the Ridge Road neighborhood of Gary, Glen Park here, or of Griffith, or of Highland, or of Munster, or of Lansing. And Ridge Road is a second beach of Lake Michigan. Now, how could a lake have two beaches? Well, it didn't have two beaches at the same time. It started out with the beach out in Dyer, Schererville on US 30, and that beach went through Glenwood, Illinois, and so that beach is referred to by geologists as the Glenwood Shoreline. And the Glenwood Shoreline was the oldest, and you can see it. And that doesn't go all the way up to Canada, because when the Glenwood Shoreline was being built, the glaciers were still covering most of Lake Michigan. not the southern part, which had already started to melt, became part of Lake Michigan. So the lake was here for there and here, all the way south to US 30 for quite a long time. But then something happened that changed the landscape completely. The ice age is coming to an end, and the ice is melting back, and soon there's more and more of Michigan and Wisconsin visible, no longer covered by ice. And when the ice melted back past the Straits of Mackinac at the northern tip of Lake Michigan, the water in the lake could pour out that way and go through what is now Lake Huron and Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River and head out to the North Atlantic. So it basically drained Lake Michigan, and there was no lake here at all. But then it got cold, and the Ice Age wasn't really over, it was just going through a warm spell. And so the ice began to advance further, and it blocked the Straits of Mackinac at the north end of the lake. And so rainwater still poured into Lake Michigan, but it couldn't get out anymore, and so the lake began to fill up with water again. But it didn't fill up with water all the way to US 30. It filled up all the way to Ridge Road. And there it developed equilibrium, and the beach was there for several hundred years and built a new beach with its own sand dunes. And both of those, the first shoreline, the Glenwood shoreline, and the Ridge Road shoreline, which is called Calumet shoreline, became Indian trails when the Indians were going around from east to west. And most of the traffic, just like automobile traffic, most of the traffic on highways in Lake County is east-west, because there's a limit to how far north you can go. And so you can go south, but you can't go north very far. So there was the Indian Trail that became US Highway 6, just like the Glenwood shoreline became US Highway 30. And then the Ice Age warmed up, and the ice melted again past the Straits of Mackinac. The water poured out again, and the ice continued to melt, with it advancing and retreating and advancing and retreating until it retreated all the way to northern Canada. And when did the Ice Age end? Well, as far as people in Dyer and Sherrville are concerned, they could say probably about 14,000 years ago. And people living in this part of Gary or in in Highland or Munster or Hobart might say, well, maybe 12,000 years ago. And people a little bit further north, way farther north, let's say at Milwaukee, would say, it's probably 10,000 years ago. And folks in northern Canada, northern Lake Michigan, at the Canadian-US border, could say the Ice Age ended maybe 8,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago. And you go north into Canada up to Baffin Island, and people would say, what do you mean the Ice Age ended? You know, the glaciers are still there. It hasn't gotten warm enough yet for that to happen. Although, if you've been paying attention to the news and all, you know that glaciers are melting in Greenland and in northern Canada. If you want to go to Glacier National Park to see glaciers, there are glaciers at National Park, but none of them are visible from where your car will be. They've all retreated so much. You can go on hikes if you carry your tent and all the food you need with you. You can go up and you can see glaciers. I wanted to see glaciers. I wanted to go on a vacation. When you're married to a geologist, you do weird things. And so we found a tour company that was doing glacial stuff, and we visited Glacier National Park. But then we headed north into Canada to the town of Banff and places like that. And the bus actually went up onto one of the glaciers. And that was really cool. The glaciers there year-round. But the water was, you could see the water draining off that glacier. Crystal clear water. I was told on my way up to take an empty water bottle with me. Now that was hard to do because I don't buy a water bottle. I don't buy water in plastic. But I got a water bottle. And what I was able to do was kneel next to a rivulet of meltwater that was flowing north and fill that bottle with truly ice cold water. And it provided the water when I went back onto the bus or whatever. And that was the water I drank for the rest of, well, until it emptied. The ice being so far out, the lake was drained again, and again, no lake at all in the Calumet region. And that situation lasted about 4,000 years. From about 10,000 years ago to about 6,000 years ago. There's no lake at all. Now, the very deepest parts of Lake Michigan, farther north, they had water, but not back here. Then the lake began to fill up with water again. And that really surprised geologists at first when they realized that this had happened. But the northern part of Michigan and Canada, having been underneath all the weight of those glaciers, the glacier pushed down on the crust of the earth and deformed it, pushed it down, sort of like if I had a basketball. I always think when I do this talk, I should bring a basketball with me and set it on a table, put my hand on it and push down, and it deforms the basketball. But I take my hand off and the ball assumes its original shape. And that's exactly what happened in the northern United States. The weight of that glacier, and glaciers are heavy. Now, I don't mean little bits of ice. A glacier is heavy. The glaciers in Antarctica are 2 miles thick. That's 8, excuse me for using an obscene term, Sears towers, 8 of them on top of each other. That would be how, from the bottom of the glacier to the top of the glacier, today in Antarctica. And in Greenland, I don't think they're quite that deep, but it's an awful lot of ice. And that weight did push the crust of the earth down. With the ice gone, the earth has been rebounding. Now, did that affect Gary, Indiana, and this part of the world? Not much. But the northern part of Lake Michigan, definitely. In fact, that rising is still occurring. It's, in the matter of millimeters per year, that kind of thing. It's not much. But it was enough that every year Lake Michigan got larger because the outlet of the lake up at Sault Ste. Marie was higher and higher and higher every year. And so the more water stayed in Lake Michigan every year until that water started flooding the Calumet region again and got up to about, in this area, about 15th to 19th Avenue in Gary. In Hammond, it would be about 169th Street. The Purdue campus is right there in that part of Hammond. You go way over towards the state line, and because the Lake Michigan, the beach today curves from, so I have to do this backwards, from Illinois to Indiana to Wisconsin to Illinois to Indiana to Michigan. And so in Hammond, about 169th where Purdue is, about 165th where Homan Avenue is, and then follows the Michigan City Road, if you know where that is in Calumet City, which is a diagonal road. And Ridge Road is kind of diagonal because it follows the old beach. And that was, that location, the lake stopped rising and it went into a sort of an equilibrium. It was about the same height, give or take a few feet every year, and developed a new beach along 15th Avenue or 169th Street. And then after that, the lake has been slowly decreasing over the next 4,000 years or so. But if it was just decreasing, it would be so easy to understand. It goes down, and then there's a drought, so it goes down a little bit further. And then the drought is over, and there's a lot of rain, so the level of the lake goes up. And then it goes down, and it goes up, and it goes down, and it goes up. But at the same time, water from Lake Huron is going down the Niagara River, down the Detroit River from Lake Huron into Lake Erie, and eroding that. So the river gets lower every year, and as the river gets lower, the lake kind of gets lower at the same time. And so each of these ups and downs is a little lower than the last up and down. And there were, before settlement in this area, over in, not here in this part of Gary, but in north of Gary, north of 15th Avenue, in Hammond, north of 169th Street, there were 150 beach ridges between the new major shoreline, which we call the Tolleston shoreline, and the current lake. 150 of these. Now comes the turn of the century and people want to build cities. East Chicago, Whiting, Hammond, Gary, South Chicago. And a landscape where you have a beach ridge and a swale and a beach ridge and a swale and a beach ridge and a swale is a lousy landscape for building a city. And so the first thing the city developers had to do was to level the land. And I grew up in Gary. I grew up on the 600 block on McKinley Street. And when I delivered papers, so I did a lot of walking around in that neighborhood. And I would walk to Broadway and things of that sort. And Gary is flat. I did not know that it hadn't been originally. That's not taught in history classes. It used to be more like corrugated corduroy pants, where you have ridges, or corrugated cardboard or something like that. That's what the landscape was like. That's a lousy landscape for trying to build streets. The first railroad that came in here followed the top of one of those beach ridges. That was the Michigan Central. And they bought a lot of land along the railroad, and some of the land that they bought they never used. And about 20, 30 years ago, they gave that land to the Lake County Parks, and it became Gibson Woods. And Gibson Woods is an area where you can see this corrugated landscape, a beach ridge, and then a low area, which is usually wet, even in the summertime. And then another beach ridge that's a little lower than the first one, and then another low swale and another beach ridge and so forth, until you get to the tracks of the edge of the park. And then from there on, it's industrial and residential and been flattened. But because the railroads owned that section of North Hammond, Hessville area, that area was never developed into businesses, commercial businesses, or residential neighborhoods. And the original landscape is still there. And when I was teaching my methods classes here on this campus, how to teach science, every year, at least one day, the class met at Gibson Woods. And then we went on a hike and walked through it so they could actually see this landscape, because the bulldozers have destroyed most of the landscape. Well, the area north of US 30, where T-Bulls is fully developed. That land was pretty flat. It was easily developed. It was already flat. It was farmed for a long time, and the farmers did the developers a big favor because they cut the trees down. And so the people who wanted to put in housing subdivisions and put in streets and strip malls and pole barns and whatever else they wanted to build. The land was already flat, and it had no trees on it because it was a cornfield or an onion field or a beans field or something like that. And so it was developed rather quickly. The area north of 169th Street and 15th Avenue here in Gary was developed kind of quickly, except for one little area where the high school was going to be built. And that high school is Horace Mann. Anybody here go to Horace Mann High School? Okay, I did. And they kept this low area, a swale, in front of they put the high school on the Dune Ridge. And then north of the high school was this low area because it was built on this corrugated landscape. And they kept it. So from Garfield east, it's flattened. From Cleveland west, it's flattened. But between those two streets, they kept the original landscape until 1959, 1960 or so, when they needed an extra football field. And they filled it all in and made it flat. And they had their extra football field for a couple of years, and then they decided a parking lot was more important, and so it became a parking lot. But anytime I use pictures of that school, you make sure you can believe that I'll use a picture taken from the south side of the lagoon, which filled that low area, so people can see what the original landscape was like. So what about Briar East Woods? Briar East Woods is south of the newest old shoreline of Lake Michigan, which is the Tolleston shoreline. And that area was wooded. 169th Street was the beach 4,700 years ago. And north of that beach, as you drive through the Hessville neighborhood, starting at Klein Avenue and driving towards Kennedy, every single street on the north side slopes down off of what had been the beach into Lake Michigan. Same feature that you'll find out at Teeble's Restaurant. But you see that at Teeble's Restaurant on the Glenwood shoreline. You see it at Giovanni's Restaurant in Munster on the Calumet shoreline, Ridge Road. You can see it in Hammond, in Hessville, along 169th Street. All the streets going down, all the ground going south, going north, down into the lake. The bulldozers did the rest. They illuminated a lot of those other ridges to fill in the wet areas and make it nice and flat. But the area south of 169th Street, they ignored. I have a 1959 map, a geologic map of the Hammond area, and it shows the Briar East Woods going all the way from Grand to Parrish, and a good deal south. Unfortunately, I lived in Hessville the first 3 years of my marriage. Now that could sound bad. Unfortunately, I lived there before I knew anything about those woods. I didn't know there were paths to walk through them. I didn't know how delightful it was. I didn't know that, unlike Gibson Woods, this landscape is made by the wind, not by the waves of Lake Michigan. It isn't made of corrugated sandscapes. It's individual dunes that were made by the wind. And 100 years of people traipsing through there and making paths and enjoying the ambience. But little by little, those woods got turned into city. Over at Grand Avenue, it was a shopping center with a grocery store. Well, those people needed a grocery store, okay? And then a strip mall with a Chinese restaurant and a laundromat and things of that sort. And then they decided to put in, as long as we have a grocery store, now we can put in high-density housing and put in an apartment complex along 169th Street. And all of these developments were taking away from the woods that used to be all the way from Grand to Parrish. Now there's a much smaller section left. And the video will tell you what the city wants to do with that.